Hey, fifth grade. Hope you're doing well in this interesting time of life. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the Bible, how it's structured. This is my wife's Bible. You may have Bibles at home. If you don't, for the assignment, you can certainly use online resources. One great one is called Bible Gateway, and you'll see the link on the website for how to use that. So, we're just going to talk a little bit about how the Bible is. There are a total of 66 books of the Bible. 39 of them are in the Old Testament, and the New Testament there are 27. So that's the total number of books in the Bible, lots of little books. And we're going to kind of talk about how those books are organized. So, as you can see here, there are 5 books called the Pentateuch. There are 12 books called the historical books. There are 5 books which we can call the poetic and wisdom books. And there are 17 books that we call the prophetic books. And then in the New Testament, there are 4 books that are called the Gospels, and then there's this one book called Acts. There are 21 books that we call the epistles. Those were letters. And then one book called Revelation. And so those are the books. And we're just going to talk a little bit about each of those sections just a little bit. So the Pentateuch is called Pentateuch because there are how many of them? 5. Penta means 5, like a pentagon has 5 sides. Or a pentatonic scale has 5 notes. So the Pentateuch has 5 books: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. They are the first 5 books in the Old Testament. They were the first 5 books that we had. You know a lot of stories, like in Genesis, you have the story of Adam and Eve, you have the story of Noah and the ark. In Exodus, you have the stories about Moses and leaving and where they were wandering around for 40 years and all of that. Leviticus has a lot of laws in it, like the 10 Commandments, and same with Numbers and Deuteronomy. But these 5 books were the first 5 books of the Bible, and they were very important to the Jewish people. Right after the Pentateuch are a bunch of historical books. So you can see we have Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. And so those books, you know about, like David and Goliath are in there, the 3 first kings of Israel. So that would be Saul, and then David, and then Solomon, and many other stories of the history of the Israel. And Ruth, as you all know, most of you know that story of Ruth very well, because that was the story that you did last year. After that are the books of the prophets. Are the poetic books and the wisdom books. So Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Songs. The book of Psalms is really a bunch of songs. A lot of them were written by King David. One that you probably know is Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He restores my soul. And it continues. And then these 3, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Songs, were all written by King Solomon. And King Solomon famously asked for wisdom from God. And so he was a very wise man. And so Proverbs is a bunch of things that you could do to be wise, and it's like advice. Ecclesiastes has some of that too, and it's really just like a long sermon that Solomon said. And Song of Songs is a book of love, and love for the church. So those are those books. After that, we had the prophetic books, and so there's a whole bunch of them: Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. And those are the last books in the Old Testament. And they're called the prophetic books because a lot of those people were prophets. They had important things that God told them to tell the people of Israel. But also they prophesy or foretold about Jesus. So here's one from the book of Isaiah, which is the first book of the prophets. From the book of Isaiah, this was some words that Isaiah wrote hundreds of years before Jesus was born. He said this, "But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed." And so a lot of people say that a lot of parts in the prophetic books were prophesying Jesus, that Jesus was going to come. And so that's what those words are. So then that's the end of the Old Testament. So the Old Testament is the Bible of the Jewish people, and they still have all of those books, but they don't believe in the New Testament. And so this is the New Testament. The first 4 books in the New Testament we call the Gospel. Now the Gospel is the good news. That's what it means. And so these 4 books tell the good news of Jesus Christ. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all tell about Jesus being born, Jesus living, Jesus working, Jesus doing miracles, Jesus loving people, and Jesus dying, and then Jesus rising from the dead on Easter, right? So that's what these 4 books, they all have different stories. Some of them have the same and tell them a little bit differently, but some of them have different stories that the other ones don't have, but they are all about Jesus. Right after that was the book of Acts, which is not really the part of the Gospels, but it doesn't fit in the epistles. So the book of Acts was a book basically about the new Christian church and about the forming of the church and what those first disciples did after Jesus rose into heaven. So that's the book of Acts. The book of the epistles, and that's just a kind of a fancy word for letters. So all of these books, like the book of Romans was a letter written to the Romans. The books of 1st and 2nd Corinthians were written to the people of Corinth who lived there. The book of Galatians was written to the people who lived in Galatia. So we have Galatians, Ephesians, Colossians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, Philemon, Hebrews, James, 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st and 2nd, 3rd John, and Jude. So those books were all letters written to those early Christians who were trying to figure out how do we be the church? How do we be Christians? And so then I just chose one part of this. Again, this is probably a familiar part for you. In 1 Corinthians 14, verse 4, it says, "Love is patient, love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It is not rude. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres." So that's just a little example of something that you might see in the epistles or the letters to the early Christians. And then the last book is the book of Revelation, and that book is a really interesting one you could check out and just kind of read it. It's a book of a dream that John had, and he wrote it down, and it's kind of about heaven, and it's kind of about what will happen when Jesus comes back, and it's just a very interesting story. And so that is just a little bit about how the Bible is organized. Your job, other than keep on preparing for the musical, which we will have, it'll be delayed, obviously, but hopefully we will figure out what that date will be, and we'll get that information to you soon. So keep working on that. But your job is, I have assigned to you one of the books of the Bible, and you're going to answer some questions about it and do a little research. You can use an actual Bible if you have one, or you can use BibleGateway.com. But also you want to probably use Google to search and find out some of the information that I'm asking you to find. Okay? Blessings to you all.